Let's look at the second group of dissidents, who I call real revolutionaries. We need a lot more real revolutionaries that are willing to put it all on the line today. The founding fathers and revolutionary colonists were true dissidents because they rejected the rulership of the British monarchy and physically fought the henchmen of British royalty for their freedom. They were brutally oppressed by psychopathic, mind-controlled order followers who traveled across an ocean at the decree of a psychopathic so-called king to take away their rights. I mean, imagine this. You want to talk about house slaves. Imagine these dirty redcoats who came across an entire ocean to oppress people that were just trying to live their lives free at the behest of some psychopathic, utter piece of trash who was probably so genetically inbred that, I mean, like King George III was an inbred piece of psychopathic trash who was barely a boy. He was some rat punk boy, okay, who wasn't even a grown-up individual, thinking he's God, I'm God, and I'm going to command these people to go over and oppress people that are saying, I no longer want to comply with the dictates of some boy God who says he's king and ruler. I mean, it's hard to tell who's worse. The psychopath giving the orders or the trash who followed his orders. They're both trash, just like they are today. Here's the piece of trash that calls himself king, and there's still people who call themselves kings and queens in the modern day. They're trash. Trash. Who need to be treated like trash. The American colonists lived under constant duress inflicted upon them by the British soldiers if they didn't obey the king's edicts or hand over any of their hard-earned resources at the king's decree. They were oppressively taxed, prevented from using alternative currencies, and had their freedom of speech curtailed, their freedom of assembly curtailed as well, and had their right to self-defense through the ownership of firearms removed. That's what really started the American Revolution. Once they started taking the guns, it was on. Just like it will be this time. Damn right. Yeah. Know it like you know your name, boys and girls. Know it like you know that sun's coming up on the eastern horizon, whether there's clouds out or not tomorrow morning. Know it like you know your name. When they start that, it's on. You know, the people who really value their freedom are not going quietly into the night because some little children want to take away their ability to defend their rights. I'll tell you that with 100% assuredness, with 1,000% assuredness. In this country, you know, you're not going to get it done. You're not going to get that done without bloodshed. Forget what Jim Morrison said, up to your ankles. No, it's going to be up over the top of your head. And that's what I'm trying to avert with all my energy. I'm trying to help people avert that bloodshed because it's going to come if we don't wise up and start understanding natural law and teaching it as widely as possible. So that image below was of the Boston Massacre, where was really the true opening volley of the American Revolution, when British soldiers fired upon Americans in Boston. The Founding Fathers and American revolutionaries physically repelled a standing army among them because they had no option but to fight and kill or die to secure their rights and the rights of their posterity. We have already entered into a situation that may require the same necessary use of defensive force. There is an ongoing deliberate conspiracy to paint the American Founding Fathers as those who did not have the best interests of the people of America at heart. I would highly urge those who have subscribed to this erroneous view to research the powerful influence of the evil globalist think tank institutions that crafted this nefarious and subversive psyop. which includes the Frankfurt School of Germany and the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations of England and the Fabian Society of England. If you don't understand these institutions, you don't understand how mind control is propagated in the modern world. And you need to learn about them, and you need to understand their influence, particularly in our educational institutions, our so-called educational institutions, which are Fabian, socialist run, owned and run. And they are taking marching orders from Tavistock. And they are taking marching orders from the former occultists that ran the Frankfurt School and propagated communist ideals and outright fascist ideals. You know, in my band, we have a song called Socio-Fascist Communazis Fuck Off. That's one of our songs, you know, because people think that they're so different, the forms of totalitarianism. Socialism and Nazism and fascism and communism, they're so different. Yeah, because they don't all want to curtail human freedom and control all the resources of people and put them into abject slavery and tyranny. No, they're all different. The left wing and the right wing are so different from each other. Two wings of the same predatory bird of prey. That one offends everybody when we play it. One of the main purposes of the PSYOP conspiracy to portray the Founding Fathers of America as quote-unquote the bad guys is to dissuade people from looking into the writings of the Founding Fathers, especially Thomas Paine and Samuel Adams, who wrote some of the highest consciousness philosophy ever written on this continent. I would also, in the Western Hemisphere, I would put Richard Wetherill up there as well. You know, as far as writing, I put Larkin Rose up there as well, you know. But these guys, I mean, you have to read their writings. You can't just hear the name and say, oh yeah, they were some of the Founding Fathers. You read their writings, you're going to understand why they're taking this out of the schools. They're not playing games. They don't want people to understand what these men thought and wrote. Another part of this PSYOP is to discredit the philosophy and writings of Thomas Jefferson, the writer of the Declaration of Independence, because he was a slave owner. While this was true, the Founding Fathers were no angels, they were not perfect men, they certainly had flaws and made mistakes and did things that were wrong. I am not condoning everything that they did, and I am not saying that they were angelic by any stretch of anybody's imagination. They were flawed men. They did not have all the answers, and many of them did not go all the way in consciousness to true anarchy and the understanding that all beings have the same rights to remain unharmed and unenslaved. So, while it was true Jefferson was a slave owner, he worked tirelessly to try to have the practice of slavery abolished in the colonies and in early America. And if you read his writings, he continuously puts forward as a theme how wrong and immoral slavery was. And let me tell you something. In the state of Virginia, where he lived, it was illegal and punishable by death to release a slave in the state willfully, because they actually did not consider them human beings and looked at it as you are going to unleash an animal upon our society. That is how fucked up their thinking was. You could have been jailed forever or put to death by the act of releasing a slave. Now, I say, whatever, it still should have been done. He still should have done it. I'm not making an excuse for why he didn't do it. He made a verbal contract upon traveling to the Second Continental Congress just before he left that upon his return he would free his slaves, and he worked tirelessly to do that. He was involved in different anti-slavery abolitionist coalitions, and he constantly advocated for this in the state of Virginia. You know, it's a very interesting story about the Declaration of Independence. You have to really understand the clashes that happened during these committees. You know, the southern states were very, very, very vehement about keeping the slavery practice in place. So Jefferson called the practice of slavery a moral depravity and a hideous blot upon society, and continually worked toward abolition. He even wrote anti-slavery clauses into the original Declaration of Independence, the original writing. But delegates of the southern colonies, led by the South Carolina Representative Edward Rutledge, threatened to strike down the motion for American independence in committee at the Second Continental Congress if Jefferson did not willfully, of his own accord, remove the anti-slavery clauses from the original draft of the Declaration of Independence. Actually, Rutledge gathered up all the delegates of all the southern colonies, and they walked out of Independence Hall in Philadelphia in mass. Benjamin Franklin and John Adams had vehement arguments with Thomas Jefferson, who said, essentially, screw them. It's staying just as I wrote it. I'm not striking these clauses because slavery is immoral. Jefferson and Adams both said to him, we have to secure independence first. And this is, yes, it is a blot upon our society. They agreed, but they said, if these other rich men who wrongly are using these human beings as their, their monetary system of labor for their crops that they grow and sell worldwide, and they walk out of this committee, America will never begin. We will never begin the country. It will die in this committee at the Continental Congress. They begged him to willfully remove the clauses, and he finally capitulated, and that's when the southern states came back in as a delegation and agreed to pass the motion for independence and sign the Declaration of Independence. But how many people know that history? Right, because we're not being taught that in schools. The neo-Marxist so-called educators want to create race division. Most of all, they don't want you to understand the philosophies that the founders were really writing. So they want to paint them as only rich white men that did not care about the practices of slavery that were taking place, and that's simply untrue. Now, that being said, some of the Southern delegates were bastards, and they held vehemently on to this immoral position. Edward Rutledge was probably the most vehement and immoral among them because he was the youngest and richest, and he had profited the most from this practice. Again, special places in hell reserved from people like that, and he was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. But you want to talk about a piece of trash, that's the piece of trash that helped to perpetuate this all the way to a point where, a war had to be fought partially about it, although we know it wasn't entirely about that. But we have to understand the Northern Founding Fathers, they wanted to abolish the practice then and there, many of them.